Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Rob Cox. Today we're talking about energy giant ExxonMobil with Steve Cole. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and most recently author of the book Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power. Thanks, Steve, for coming on. So one of the things that comes across in your book is that ExxonMobil is sort of laser focused on shareholder value. Now, that's been good for shareholders in one respect, but it's also created a certain myopia, which you've brought out in the book. I mean, explain a little bit about this obsession with shareholder value.
Well, they're a very closed company, first of all. You know, it's a place where you come in out of college or graduate school and stay for life. They don't have a lot of lateral hires, so they have a very kind of internal focus on their own culture and their own way of doing things, and shareholder value is at the center of everything that they invest in and do, and it has left them with a reputation for being not very great partners. Their peers in the oil industry see them as sort of go it alone and arrogant at times, and yet they've been able to deliver financial performance that has been very durable over a long period of time.
And how does it manifest itself, that sort of obsession? Is it metrics that they look at the exclusion of others? Is it an inability to see where they might reputationally make mistakes because they're focused on those metrics?
On the positive side, they have an investment committee system that reviews every dollar that they invest and seems to have developed a method for making better decisions than the average oil company about that. So there's a lot of rigor, a lot of data.
What a lot of people in the market talk about return on invested capital as Exxon being, the sort of the leader in that.
You can use return on capital employed as your metric, or you can use other metrics, but it basically is the same thing. What's the gatekeeping system at the top of the company for deciding on big investments in production projects or exploration or the rest? So that they do well. Where it gets in their way is that they live in a world of partnerships. They have to compete, yes, with other super majors and with state-owned oil companies, but they also have to partner with governments. They have to deal with non-governmental organizations campaigning around environmental issues, human rights issues, global warming, and they take the same playbook that they apply to their incredibly rigid investment discipline, and then they apply it to everything else they do: political strategy, communication strategy, lobbying strategy, and so they end up, I think, getting in their own way some of the time.
Right. One of the issues they've had is safety. You know, we had the Exxon Valdez thing back 20-something years ago. How that's, of course, changed the safety culture of the place.
It was a kind of catalyst for reform. They had,
but that's also it's also beneficial for shareholders because you don't want to have to end up paying huge judgments.
Yeah, and it's a good, it's the safest place to work in the oil industry today, which is good for everybody. And they've established an operating system that has then been adopted by other companies because it's recognized as pretty much the gold standard. But all of that came out of a catastrophe that followed a pretty bad decade of management discipline. They had cut their workforce by 80,000 before that Valdez wreck. They were sort of in a state of disarray, much like BP, frankly, was before the Deepwater Horizon accident in 2010. And I think the larger point is, here's now ExxonMobil, a very disciplined company, but its business is driving it increasingly into greater and greater risk. Some of it's political risk because they can't access the easy oil in the Middle East anymore, so they end up in unstable African countries. Some of it is geological risk because in order to create value, to beat out the Russian companies, they have to be able to drill in deeper and deeper water or under the Arctic where nobody else can get it done.
So what is a very conservative company generally has been forced, because you have the national oil companies are saying, stay out of my place. The easy place is to, the Algerias, or that you stick the straw in the ground, you pull it out for $3 per barrel, whatever.
Right.
I mean, they're having to go into deep water. I mean, how do you grapple with that if you're a company that is so intensely conservative with what is essentially like really risky wildcat type?
Well, that's the central tension in their strategy and in this book. I mean, I found over time that as more I understood, the more I saw this tension as the heart of it. On the one hand, they were trying to wring all of human fallibility out of their daily industrial operations, and for good reason. They're dangerous, they're huge, if a little mistake can be very costly, both in human terms but also financially. So they have this very rule-bound, rigid system of conservative kind of practices. And on the one hand, the environments, for the reasons you just described, that they're operating in are increasingly frontier environments, whether political or geological frontiers. And we know that On the one hand, yeah, you can wring a lot of human fallibility out of big industrial operations, but when people interact with huge industrial systems in the real world, eventually someone makes a mistake. I mean, the Japanese thought their nuclear industry was bulletproof, and now they don't have one.
Well, it's certainly not tsunami-proof. One of the ways to deal with it, of course, is to go into less risky, politically risky areas. So the big XTO takeover of a couple of years ago was one, was clearly designed to to get into the fracking business, gas business in the United States, which has its own risk, financial risk, but of course was also meant to be a sidestep some of the political problems you'd have in, in places like, say, Venezuela.
Right.
How does that turn out, though?
Well, it's early days, but you described it correctly. First of all, it's the biggest strategic departure that Rex Tillerson, the current chairman and chief executive, has made since he came to office in 2006. And he's making not only a big bet on natural gas, but he is returning to the United States, which has some advantages. The political risk profile looks better than Venezuela or West Africa. On the other hand, it's not no profile, because you've got environmental campaigners resisting fracking now.
Fracking is such a huge divisive issue, and people are very divided on whether or not the economic advantages outweigh some of the environmental ones.
Yeah, and if you're going to be honest about it, it's a new frontier. We don't know everything that there is to know about fracking because it hasn't been done on this scale before. So there are going to be questions, and there are going to be debates about these cost-benefit analyses.
Yeah.
But the advantage of being in the United States in comparison to Africa or the Middle East is at least we have property rights. So
that's right.
If you can find oil and gas in large quantities, large enough quantities to be meaningful to ExxonMobil with its huge scale, at least you can own it.
What about in Washington? I mean, certainly they have been one of the biggest lobbying groups or at least supported a lot of the big lobbying for the oil industry. Is there a risk that there's a backlash against big oil and particularly Exxon?
Well, big oil is, it's a tough client to have if you're in the PR business.
Yeah.
And one of the things I tried to look at is what's it like to be hated? What are the consequences of it? They sort of tend to get into a defensive crouch and say it doesn't matter. Big oil's never been popular. There's nothing we can do to fix it. And after all,
I think about their sort of refutation of climate change science and things like that. I mean, the majority of people tend to believe that there's something to it.
Yes.
And yet the oil industry has fought tooth and nail against that. I mean, how
they've been radical on that issue, and I think they've suffered real reputational damage. So why does it matter to them actually? I think there are at least 2 or 3 reasons. One is they are going to have trouble over the next 30 or 40 years retaining and recruiting the very best scientific talent if whenever those scientists go home to their families and say where they work, everyone draws in their breaths. It's not like saying
Exxon, I'll move on to the cocktail party.
Yeah, it's not like working at Apple.
There's a Google guy over there.
Exactly, or someone can get me an iPod. And so I think over 30 or 40 years in a globalized world, that's actually a real problem. The other thing is that in the oil business on a global scale, you've got to be a good partner, I think, increasingly. That's certainly their competitors' argument about them, Shell or others. We live to be great partners. We're Dutch, we're British, we know how the world works, and we can work with diverse partners in business and in government. They don't have that reputation. They basically overcome that lack of a reputation by saying, we may be lousy in the sandbox, but we're going to come in on time, on budget. You're going to get your money, and nothing is going to blow up. And so do business with us.
Right.
Now, is that really a 30 or 40 year strategy in the world we're moving into? I'm not so sure.
Well, it's also, there's high risk because if one of those elements goes wrong, if you have a mistake, and mistakes do happen, then you don't have the resilience. You've lost all of your
you don't have resilience. And even now, it's very hard for them to go into a courtroom with a jury because they're basically already behind. They get these billion-dollar jury verdicts. Usually they overturn them on appeal, almost always they do. But it's not good for business to be in front of an ordinary citizen of a jury of American citizens who come in with an assumption that you've done wrong.
But is Exxon good for America?
They are our energy policy. They're our state-owned oil company.
We don't have a
They are, and it's funny because all industrialized democracies in this global energy environment have a huge state-owned oil company, Total in France, Eni in Italy, and so on. And ExxonMobil is ours. And yet they live in opposition to the state. I mean, Rex Tillerson, the chairman and chief executive, said recently that his favorite book is Ayn Rand. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And, so only in America would our state-owned oil company not be run by people who are pals with the folks in Washington, but who actually see themselves as opponents of concentrated power, actually while sitting on a huge example of concentrated power. So it's a funny thing. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah.
I'm Rob Cox. Join me again next week for another episode of The Exchange.